She had never imagined that the happiest day of her life would become the moment that shattered her into pieces. The church bells had tolled in celebration, the air filled with lilies and murmured blessings, yet as she stood at the altar, hands trembling, heart pulsing with sincerity, her groom looked at her tear-stained face and smirked. "Crying already?" he said loudly enough for the entire pew to hear, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Try not to look so pathetic. People are watching." The guests laughed behind gloved hands, whispers rippling through the grand church like cold wind through an empty hall. She blinked, humiliated, wishing the marble floor would swallow her whole. She had always been gentle, emotional, soft-hearted, and he used that softness as a weapon. Her tears, which flowed from love, were twisted into weakness for the amusement of society. When she stumbled over her vows, he shook his head exaggeratedly, rolling his eyes as if she were an inconvenience he was forced to tolerate. But what broke her most was not the mockery. It was the realization in that moment that she had mistaken cruelty for affection, pride for partnership, and her own hopeful heart for something he would ever value. She fled after the ceremony not to applause but to murmurs of "poor thing, too sensitive, unfit for marriage." The heavy wooden doors closed behind her, shutting out the cold laughter and judgment. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft drops rolling down her face, mingling with her tears until she could no longer tell one sorrow from another. She walked through London's grey streets, a white bride's gown trailing in the mud, feeling smaller with every step. She had no destination, no strength, no voice left. All she had was the echo of his humiliation following her like a bitter ghost. By the time she reached her small flat, shivering and broken, she collapsed on the wooden floor and allowed herself to cry, not the quiet, controlled tears expected of a lady, but the deep, shaking sobs of a woman whose heart had been shattered publicly and carelessly. For days she hid from the world, avoiding the newspapers that reported her failed wedding with glee. But grief, when left alone, eventually transforms. Pain, when pushed long enough, reshapes itself into determination. And humiliation, when burned in the heart of a woman with courage, becomes a spark capable of lighting an entire city on fire. She picked up a pen, her oldest companion, and began to write, not about love or heartbreak, but about truth, about what it meant to be mocked, to be dismissed, to be underestimated. She wrote pages upon pages, her emotions pouring onto the paper like a storm she could finally control. She signed her work with a simple pseudonym, Evelyn Hart, without the a heart that had been broken, remade, reborn. Her anonymous essays were published quietly at first, tucked into the corner of London's lesser-known literary papers. Yet something about her writing struck a chord across the city. Her words were sharp but gentle, fierce but graceful, echoes of a woman who had tasted humiliation and chosen not to drown in it. Her essays spread through coffee houses, academies, parliament corridors, and drawing rooms. Women read her words and found courage. Men read her words and found insight. Even the city's elite, who once gossiped about her failed wedding, now debated her thoughts with admiration and awe. Soon, editors clamored to publish her next piece. Newspapers began printing her pseudonym in elegant scripted fonts, and within months, Evelyn Hart became the most talked-about writer in London. But no one knew the truth. No one recognized the quiet woman who had once cried at her own wedding. No one connected the humiliated bride to the brilliant mind, now shaping public thought. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a grand literary exhibition at the Royal Hall, the organizers honored the mysterious Evelyn Hart, inviting her to speak. London filled the gleaming hall, noblemen and scholars whispering excitedly about the elusive writer. Reporters crowded near the stage, ready to capture the face behind the words that had moved an entire city. When she stepped into the light, no longer in a stained wedding gown but in a simple ivory dress, confidence radiating from her, they gasped. Her groom, now present among the audience, went pale. The same woman he mocked for crying now stood before a city that rose in applause. Her voice did not tremble when she spoke. She thanked London for embracing her words, for listening when others had not, for seeing her worth when she herself had almost forgotten it. Every sentence echoed with the strength of a woman who had learned to build herself from her own ruins. When she finished, the crowd erupted in a standing ovation, an ocean of admiration, respect, and reverence. That day, London did not just cheer her name. London worshipped it. And the man who mocked her tears at the wedding could do nothing but bow his head in shame. She had always been gentle, soft-voiced, and full of emotion, traits her groom considered flaws rather than gifts. And on the day she stood at the altar, trembling with sincerity, those traits became his favorite weapon. Her tears slipped down her cheeks as she tried to speak her vows, overwhelmed not by fear but by the depth of what marriage meant to her. Instead of taking her hand or offering comfort, her groom scoffed loudly, turning the most sacred moment of her life into a spectacle. "Good heavens, must you cry at everything?" he said, rolling his eyes as laughter rippled through the pews. "Try not to ruin the ceremony with your foolish dramatics." She froze, heat burning her skin as whispers spread like wildfire. Guests nudged each other, some snickered behind fans. Even the priest hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Her humiliation was complete, until her gaze, desperate and blurry with tears, met the eyes of the Duke of Ashbourne, standing among the witnesses like a silent shadow carved from steel. He had come only as a courtesy guest, expecting nothing more than another dull society wedding. But when he saw her crumble under public mockery, something in his expression shifted, subtle, dangerous, protective. No one noticed except her. A faint tightening of his jaw, a flare in his eyes. He looked away, but not before she saw a spark of something she had never received from the man she was marrying, understanding. She forced herself through the rest of the ceremony, but her spirit had cracked. When the final words were spoken, she didn't stay for congratulations. She fled, leaving behind whispers, laughter, and a groom who was far more concerned with greeting influential guests than comforting his new wife. She slipped into the empty corridor, her heart aching, her future suffocating her. She found an unused drawing room, closed the door, and finally allowed her silent sobs to escape. And that was where the Duke of Ashbourne found her, not because he followed her, but because he had stepped away from the crowd to escape their shallow chatter. He opened the door, expecting solitude, and instead found the bride curled against the wall, her gown trembling with each broken breath. He did not speak, not at first. He simply stood there watching her with a quiet intensity, unsure whether to leave or offer comfort. When she noticed him, she quickly wiped her tears, embarrassed beyond measure. "Your Grace, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to disturb." "You disturb nothing," the Duke said softly. His voice was low, deep, steady, the kind of voice that felt like shelter. "But I believe you deserve far better company than the mockery you received at the altar." His words struck her like a warm tide after drowning. No one, not even her own groom, had ever spoken to her like that. But she didn't stay, she couldn't. After the reception, she slipped out of her own wedding and vanished from London society for weeks. Rumors spread. Scandal bloomed. Her husband barely noticed. He claimed she was overly sensitive and needed time to compose herself. But the Duke, he remembered her, not the scandal, not the gossip, her voice. The small, fragile voice she had used to apologize for crying. A voice that shook with pain but carried something extraordinary. She had no idea that the Duke had been searching for her, not romantically, but with a conviction he couldn't explain. And she certainly didn't know her life was about to transform in the most unexpected way. For though she had hidden herself from the world, she found solace in the one thing that had always brought her peace: music. Her singing, once a private comfort, became her escape. In a small boarding house by the river, she would sit by the window at night and let her voice fill the air, soft, aching, ethereal. The landlady heard her first. Then passers-by paused outside her window, moved by a voice that felt like a confession wrapped in melody. Soon an invitation arrived from a private gathering hosted by one of London's most influential patrons of the arts. She attended reluctantly, veiled, nervous, but when she sang, the room fell silent. Her voice, unlike anything London had heard, carried not just talent but truth. Pain, humility, heart. What she didn't know was that the Duke of Ashbourne was there too. He had been invited by chance, certainly not expecting to hear the bride he'd seen cry at the altar. But when she stepped onto the small stage and opened her mouth to sing, recognition slammed into him like lightning. The woman mocked for her tears, possessed a voice powerful enough to command an entire room. London felt the same. Within days, salons fought for her presence. Poets wrote about her. Composers begged to work with her. The newspapers called her the Siren of London, a voice woven from heartbreak and hope. And for the first time in her life, she stood before society without trembling. They did not laugh now. They did not whisper. They worshipped her. And her groom. He sat in the back of the grand concert hall the night she debuted publicly. When the spotlight illuminated her face and London rose in roaring applause, he realized, far too late, that the woman he mocked for crying was now the woman the entire city adored. Standing beside her was the Duke of Ashbourne, silent protector, eyes filled with something deeper than admiration. And London knew. Her tears had not broken her. They had made her unforgettable. She had dreamed of her wedding day since she was a little girl stitching scraps of ribbon into her doll's dresses. But when she finally stood at the altar, heart trembling with sincerity, eyes glistening with hope. Her groom leaned close and whispered loud enough for half the guests to hear, "If you cry any harder, people will think I've forced you into this. Do try to control yourself. You look pitiful." Laughter rippled through the rows like a cruel breeze. She blinked rapidly, trying to steady herself, but her tears only fell faster, and with every drop her groom's smirk widened. When she stumbled through her vows, he shook his head dramatically, as if embarrassed to be near her. "Honestly," he muttered, "you look like a child." The humiliation struck her harder than any slap could. The church blurred, the whispers sharpened. Her throat tightened until she could barely breathe. And in that moment, heart cracked, dignity shattered. She realized she could not marry a man who despised her softness. Before the priest could continue, she stepped back from the altar, lifted her skirts, and ran down the aisle, leaving gasps and scandal blooming in her wake. She did not return home, not immediately. She wandered through London's stone streets, ignoring the rain soaking into her gown, the mud splattering the hem, the stares of passers-by. When she finally reached her tiny room above the modiste's workshop where she once apprenticed, she shut the door, fell onto the floor, and cried until her lungs ached. The newspapers would mock her. Society would devour her. Her groom, soon to be her former groom, would boast about the fragile, dramatic woman who ran from her own wedding. But in that small room, surrounded by scraps of fabric, needles, and unfinished dreams, something inside her shifted. Pain sharpened into clarity. Humiliation hardened into resolve. If the world saw her as weak, she would build something stronger than their opinions. If they mocked her tears, she would create something so breathtaking they would have no choice but to look up to her. She wiped her face, stood before her worktable, and began to sew. What began as an attempt to distract herself became a transformation. Hours blurred into days, days into weeks. Her hands moved with a fierce, focused grace no one had ever witnessed. She stitched gowns unlike anything London had ever seen, gowns shaped by emotion, by heartbreak, by fire, colors that represented survival, silhouettes that whispered rebellion, details so delicate they felt like secrets sewn into fabric. And because she had nothing left to lose, she dared to design boldly. Fearlessly, honestly. Her first creation, a pale rose gown embroidered with tiny glass tears, caught the eye of her former employer, Madame Delacroix, who gasped when she saw it displayed on the dress form. "Who made this?" she demanded. When the woman answered, timid but steady, Madame Delacroix stared as if seeing her for the first time. "My dear," she whispered, "this is genius." Within hours, the dress was delivered to the Countess of Worthing, who wore it to the Marlowe ball. She walked into the glittering ballroom, and the room stilled. Every head turned, every lady stared, every rival burned. And in the hushed glow of chandeliers, the Countess declared, "It is designed by a young, unknown dressmaker, an absolute prodigy." The next morning, half of London's elite arrived at Madame Delacroix's shop demanding to meet the mysterious designer. But the woman refused to show her face, not out of pride, but out of fear. Her scandalous wedding escape still haunted London gossip. What they praised, they might condemn just as easily. So she worked from the shadows, stitching dreams into silk, pouring her heart into every bead. She became a myth, a rumor, a sensation. Society magazines called her the ghost seamstress. Aristocrats fought over her creations. Ladies wept when they could not secure an appointment. Her gowns became symbols of transformation. Every woman who wore them felt stronger, braver, more radiant. London adored her work long before it ever knew her name. But fate has a talent for revealing beauty at the perfect moment. The Duchess of Pembroke, known for hosting the grandest charity gala of the season, demanded that the mysterious designer appear in person. When Madame Delacroix gently insisted that the young woman must attend the unveiling, she had no choice. With trembling hands, she put on the gown she had designed for herself, a gown she had crafted from the very heartbreak that once shattered her. It was ivory silk, soft as moonlight, with silver threads weaving the story of a rising phoenix across the skirt. It was the first dress she made for her own healing, not for clients. And when she stepped into the Duchess's ballroom, she shimmered like rebirth personified. The crowd gasped, whispers rippled. The Duchess herself hurried forward. "My dear," she breathed, "London has waited for you." And then she saw him, her former groom, in the crowd. His face pale, his pride crushed. He stared at her as if seeing a stranger, a goddess, a force, a woman he had never deserved. But she did not look away. Instead, she smiled, calm, confident, victorious. She had sewn her own resurrection, stitch by stitch. And now, London worshipped the name he once mocked. The wedding was meant to be beautiful. Golden chandeliers, rose-petaled aisles, whispered blessings floating through the cathedral like perfume. But beauty cannot soften cruelty, and cruelty was what she faced as she stood trembling before the altar. Her voice quivered as she tried to speak her vows, her eyes overflowing with the weight of all the emotions she had kept buried for years. Instead of holding her hand, her groom leaned close with a bitter smile and whispered loudly enough for guests to hear, "Heavens, must you cry at everything? Try not to embarrass me today of all days." Laughter rippled through the pews like a cold wave. Society women smirked behind their fans, men exchanged amused glances. Her tears, born from sincerity, devotion, and overwhelming feeling, were twisted into a spectacle. She felt her throat close, her heart shudder, her dreams collapse inwards. And as her groom shook his head dramatically, saying, "Do compose yourself, everyone is looking," she realized that he had never understood her, never cherished her softness, never intended to treat her with kindness. She broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly like a candle snuffed by wind. She lifted the hem of her gown and ran, her shoes slipping on the marble as gasps filled the cathedral. She burst out through the grand doors into the courtyard, gulping crisp air as if breathing for the first time. Tears blurred her vision as she fled down the stone path, her wedding veil fluttering behind her like a ghost of the life she had almost sealed herself into. What she didn't know was that someone had watched her, not with mockery, but with stillness, with an artist's instinct, with a man's intuition sharpened by truth. The royal court painter, Lord Adrian Hawkesbury, had been standing near the entrance sketching the architecture for an upcoming commission. He had no interest in society weddings, no desire to mingle with nobles, and certainly no expectation of witnessing a bride flee her own ceremony. But when he saw her break through those cathedral doors, a white blur of trembling emotion, something in him froze. Her expression, raw, unfiltered, wounded, was more powerful than any staged portrait he had ever painted. Most nobles he painted wore masks. She wore her soul. She nearly collided with him, but stumbled to a halt, wiping her tears furiously, ashamed to have another witness to her humiliation. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "You don't need to apologize," Adrian said softly, voice deep and steady as an artist's hand. "But if you will allow me, may I help you?" His tone was neither pitying nor curious. It was gentle, genuine, the kind of softness she had been starved of. She shook her head, unable to speak. Yet the kindness in his eyes kept her rooted. It had been years since anyone looked at her as if her emotions were not something to be mocked, but something to be understood. Adrian saw it instantly, her heartbreak, her vulnerability, her strength barely holding itself together. He had painted queens, duchesses, nobles of every rank, yet none had ever carried such raw truth in their expression. And an idea bloomed in him with startling clarity. "Forgive my boldness," he said, "but I would like to paint you." She blinked, startled. "Paint me like this, crying." "Especially like this," he replied. "There are many kinds of beauty, but the world rarely sees this one honesty." She almost refused, but something inside her, something small, flickering, desperate to be seen without judgment, whispered yes. That very week, she stepped into his studio, wearing no jewels, no fine silks, only a simple dress and eyes still shadowed by what she had endured. She expected to feel exposed, but Adrian created an atmosphere of reverence, not scrutiny. He studied her as an artist studies a rare treasure, not with desire, but with awe. "Your tears," he murmured as he mixed his paints, "do not diminish you, they unmask you. That is far more powerful than perfection." Day after day she sat for him, and with each session she shed not just tears but old fears. She spoke. He listened. She trembled. He steadied her. She began to heal not because he painted her, but because he saw her, truly saw her. When the portrait was completed, Adrian titled it, "The Woman Who Felt Deeply." The Royal Exhibition accepted it instantly. And on the night it was unveiled, London arrived in glittering gowns and tailored coats, prepared to admire landscapes and portraits of royals. But when they reached Adrian's painting, hers, they fell silent. Stunning, vulnerable, heartbreakingly real. Her tears shimmered on the canvas like jewels. Her gaze, soft yet brave, pierced the soul of every person who stood before her image. A whisper broke through the stunned crowd. "Who is she?" The answer swept the exhibition like wildfire. "It is the bride who fled her wedding." Gasped shock, shame not hers but theirs. London had mocked her tears. London had whispered behind her back. London had laughed. Now London stood humbled before the beauty of her pain. The Duchess of Pembroke demanded to meet her. The Prince Regent himself praised the portrait. Critics called her the most expressive muse in a generation. Society women, once cruel, now envied her. Men, once indifferent, now admired her strength. And she, standing beside the portrait, no longer hid her tears. London finally understood. Her tears were art. Her emotions were strength. Her heart was magnificent. And the man who mocked her at the wedding, he could only watch from the shadows as London worshipped the woman he once belittled, forever immortalized by a painter who saw the beauty in her soul. She had always believed that love was gentle, that marriage meant safety, partnership, tenderness. But standing at the altar, surrounded by flickering candlelight and whispering guests, she realized how wrong she was. Her voice trembled as she tried to speak her vows, overwhelmed by the moment, overwhelmed by feeling. And instead of offering comfort, her groom sighed loudly, tilting his head back in irritation. "For heaven's sake," he muttered loud enough for half the cathedral to hear, "you are crying again. Must you always be so dramatic? Control yourself. People are watching." Laughter quietly erupted behind fans. A pair of ladies smirked. Even the groomsmen exchanged knowing looks. Humiliation swept through her like icy wind, turning her cheeks scarlet and her heart hollow. She tried to continue, but her tears fell faster, betraying her pain, exposing her sincerity, making her an easy target. Her groom rolled his eyes dramatically, adding, "This is precisely why people think you're unfit for society. Always emotional, always weak." Weak. The word struck her like a blade. Something inside her broke, not loudly but silently, like a delicate vase shattering behind closed doors. She looked into the eyes of the man she was about to marry and saw nothing but disdain. No warmth, no partnership, only disappointment that she was not colder, harder, more like him. So she did the bravest thing a woman could do in a world determined to crush her spirit. She walked away. She lifted her skirts, turned from the altar, and strode down the aisle as gasps filled the grand cathedral. She didn't look back once. Not at the stunned guests, not at the shocked priest, not at the groom whose mouth hung open in disbelief. Her tears stained her veil as she threw open the heavy doors and stepped into the sunlight, still crying, still trembling, but for the first time in her life free. London mocked her, of course, the runaway bride, the crybaby duchess-to-be, though no duchess had ever cried more courageously. Gossip pages dramatized the event for weeks. No one cared to ask why she left. No one cared about the cruelty she endured. They only cared for the scandal. So she disappeared. Not into hiding, but into purpose. The city slums had always haunted her. She'd seen children no older than 10 working in dangerous factories, women starving in alleyways, families crushed by debts. She had wanted to help, but society taught her that noblewomen existed only to smile, marry, and obey. But now that society had rejected her, she rejected society right back. She went to the factories first, disguised in a plain cloak, speaking to the young workers whose fingers were scarred from machinery. Then to the widow shelters where mothers clutched sick infants. Then to the orphanage overflowing with children London pretended not to see. She used every penny of her dowry, yes, the very dowry her groom had salivated over, to buy bread, medicine, blankets, and coal for the poor. She visited politicians, demanding reforms. She wrote letters to newspapers, exposing the brutality of labor conditions. She organized volunteer groups, convincing even the coldest aristocrats that human suffering was not a decoration to walk past at night. At first, no one listened. Then one mother survived childbirth thanks to her help. Then a little boy she rescued from a factory grew strong enough to walk again. Then a jealous husband of a laborer thanked her with trembling hands. And slowly, slowly, London took notice. Not of her tears, not of her wedding scandal, but of her courage. They began to whisper a new name for her. The guardian angel of London. Her former groom scoffed when he heard it, until the newspapers printed her portrait, drawn from life by a young artist she had helped. She looked radiant, glowing, transformed, not because of beauty or jewels, but because purpose had lit her from within. She no longer looked like the fragile bride who had fled the altar. She looked like a woman who had rebuilt herself from ashes. Soon, the city she once feared became the city that adored her. Merchants offered donations. Aristocrats handed her keys to unused estates for shelters. Parliament members requested meetings with her. Children she rescued called her Mama Angel. And when the Queen heard of her work, she invited her to the palace, an honor even the richest ladies prayed for. On the day of the royal ceremony, thousands lined the streets. She arrived not in a wedding gown stained by heartbreak, but in a soft blue dress she had designed herself, simple, elegant, powerful. The crowd erupted in applause. Women cried, men removed their hats. Children clung to the railings, waving handmade flowers. She walked with her chin high, not hiding her emotions anymore. Her tears had once been mocked. Now they were revered. And somewhere in the crowd, her former groom watched, face pale, pride crumbling. He had mocked her tears. Yet here she was, standing before the Queen. And London worshipped her.